Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on infrastructure replacement plans for municipalities. You notice I've changed the title to say Reserve Studies for Municipalities, and that's just the first point of our webinar today. We got our start as a company just over 30 years ago preparing reserve studies for residential community associations. So think about condos, townhomes, planned developments, those types of properties. Reserve study is the art and science of anticipating and helping ownership and management then responsibly anticipate and financially prepare for the major repair and replacement projects of the property. Basically, this means recommending how much needs to be set aside in reserve to provide for those projects. So after this start serving residential clients, we soon began fielding calls from city controllers or building engineers saying they were a board member at their condo association and wondering if we could do the same type of thing for their city facilities. So it's been a natural fit for our company. But many of you are new to this concept, and we felt that there was a good chance the term reserve study didn't mean anything to you. So we advertised the webinar using a more generic description, calling them infrastructure replacement plans. Well, preparing these reserve studies for municipality clients is one of our fastest growing business segments, so we prepared this introductory class on the subject, hoping that those of you responsible for municipal facilities can get more familiar with reserve studies and their benefits. So perhaps you've heard of reserve studies, or maybe you've imagined such a thing as an infrastructure replacement plan. Maybe you've been commissioned to create one for your facility. But at the end of today's webinar, you'll be clear on what one is and the valuable information that it provides. So, welcome to our webinar. Let me start with a few housekeeping comments before we get going. As a reminder, this is a live presentation and everyone's been muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. I want to point out a few controls that appear on your screen. I like an interactive presentation, so every once in a while I may ask for your feedback, and the way to respond is to raise your hand by clicking on the hands raised icon in your control panel that looks like the one you see on screen. And if you came with a question, as Paige indicated, or if at any time you have a question that arose due to something I've said, just type it in the dialog box in your control panel, again similar to the one that you see on screen. Paige will be monitoring that throughout our session today and select from those that you've entered at the end during our Q&A session. I hope you have some paper and are taking notes, but just to give you some peace of mind, I want to let you know that the session today is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website for future reference. In addition, we'll create and send an outline to all attendees who fill out a survey at the end of today's session, another good reference to have on hand. So without further delay, let's give it a test. Give me a hands raised if you're ready for me to get going on the presentation. Grab your mouse, give me a hands raised. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to put hands down. And here we go. I'll be addressing how to prepare financially for inevitable expenses at your facilities, whatever they might be. They might be an established classic city hall, something that's been around for a long time. It may be a newer facility. This is actually the city hall where I live. It may be different types of buildings, different purposes. Here's a police station and city hall combination. Here's a library, obviously, significant for its public use. But in fact, there's many types of facilities that we have been hired to help with. City hall, library, police station, fire station, water treatment plants, maintenance yards, bus stations, bus yards, recreation facilities, parks, bus stops, some bridges, and we did a few engagements that were subsidized housing units. That was actually one of our earliest engagements. But I want to make sure you understand it's not just the type of facility that planning is important, it's also the age, but it's not just old facilities. This shows a brand new City Hall building, and I want to remind you that from the day it's built, all facilities are alike and that they all deteriorate. All their major components begin to deteriorate. And here's a typical expense pattern among our clients. It'll look something like this. Now, we're not talking about expenses like janitorial or ongoing maintenance, salaries, landscaping, service contracts. Today we're going to talk about the large capital repair and replacement expenses, the infrastructure repair and replacement expenses. And these are the ones that are very unpleasant if you don't prepare for them and if they occur as a surprise. So irregular, major, significant expenses. Now, the key point though is, even though these expenses look irregular and random, they're all very predictable. And because they're predictable, they become manageable. They are not random. These are all very stable, predictable projects. But because they are irregular and they occur in the future, what we find is the most common strategy is what we call head in the sand, basically ignoring it and pretending it's not real. We all know new is nice. New gets attention. The maintenance, repairs, and replacements that are inevitable and ongoing are a fundamental cost of running the facility, but they don't get people's attention. People get attention, the leadership usually gets attention when it's new and planning and exciting things like that. Now, the other second most common strategy is to ignore and engage in wishful thinking. But wishful thinking, hoping a large expense won't happen on your watch or can be deferred, that's not an effective strategy. Wishful thinking has never been an effective strategy. Those expenses will occur whether you're ignoring them or wishing they'll happen another time. Basically, the roof doesn't care, the HVAC system doesn't care, really doesn't care what you think. They're deteriorating on schedule. So you're presented generally with a pretty clear choice. You can either be a victim or you can be in control. You can grab control of the situation. And this is where we come in and we can help. So how do you take control? Well, it starts with getting the information you need. It's summarized in a reserve study, and that shows you what's going to happen, when, and how much it's going to cost. Basically a window onto your future. And this is the key concept, that these expenses are inevitable. They will occur whether or not you take control and become prepared. The roof will leak, the asphalt will crumble, pumps will fail, elevators will need modernization. It's only a matter of if you are prepared or not when those expenses occur. You're going to have a much better future if you've prepared. And we're in the business of providing improved futures. But as I'm talking about improved futures, I want to make sure we're clear on terminology. Our reserves for the present or the future. Got an idea in your mind? Well, I'm going to recommend that reserve contributions, the funds that we set aside, they are for the present. The reserve planning is for the present. The reserve contributions, the funds that you set aside, offset ongoing deterioration. And you're going to have much more success as you characterize this whole subject with others if you characterize it in these present tense terms. Deterioration is very real and predictable. The costs need to be set aside on an ongoing basis to offset that deterioration. And if you do so, the future will take care of itself. But you have to appreciate that the future is easy to ignore. It's someone else's problem. So don't fight human nature. Characterize the cost of deterioration as an ongoing expense. And without preparation, you're falling behind. So let's take another look at that expense scenario. Again, at first look, it can appear pretty darn random. Some large years, some low years, pretty good spread over the next 30 years. But here are the actual line items of components generating these expenses. I developed a nice little 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 component example set. And you look at them individually and they're all very real and very predictable. Now, you and I know with experience that as we push out into the future, those expenses may get a little bigger or smaller, likely a little bigger with inflation, but even in just present dollar terms, the scope might change a little bit, or timing-wise, they may get a year or two closer if you do some good maintenance, or maybe if you don't do good maintenance, or maybe further away, but they all will happen. The roof will need to be replaced. The hot water system, the boiler is going to need to be replaced. The building is going to need to be repainted. All these are very predictable projects. So the question becomes, what's your plan to deal with these inevitable, predictable expenses? And how do you sell such a plan or get others on board to create such a plan? Well, let's talk about benefits. I mentioned briefly that we're in the business of providing improved futures. Well, so what's improved about it? Well, first, you get to avoid surprises. When you know projects and expenses are coming, then you're not surprised. You're basically prepared. And the second, you save potentially a lot of money by avoiding band-aid projects, multiple mobilization costs when projects have to be broken into parts, or the large cost overruns due to deferred maintenance as projects get much larger and more expensive than originally budgeted. So you can save a lot of money by doing things on time, on schedule, with a very controlled scope of work. And then keeping your facilities well maintained makes them inviting, whether that be for the civil servants who work there or the citizens who use those facilities. And it reflects well on the stewardship of the city, taking good care of what it owns, basically what it's purchased or built and developed with taxpayer dollars. And of course, while big expenses may be irregular, there's no reason the city or county's budget needs to be irregular. And as I said earlier, when you're setting funds aside to match the ongoing deterioration, which is smooth, uniform, and predictable, the funds will be ready and waiting in the future when they're needed. So you can stabilize your cash flow. You don't have to deal with that expense as singular events. You can just set aside money on a very stable manner, in a very stable pattern, stabilize your budget, and then when the expense happens, you're ready. Okay, so what is a reserve study? It's a document that pulls all this information together, and it's all done according to a nice set of national standards that were established back in 1998. And that nice four-point rule is something that I can get into in just a few moments. What it's not is, well, let me just make sure we're all set with appropriate expectations. It's not an expensive A&E infrastructure study. It's not an ADA evaluation. It's not a safety survey. It's not a construction defect investigation. And it's not specifically a repair or replace analysis, although a reserve study certainly helps you identify projects and costs so you can make informed decisions about minor repairs and maybe when to replace an entire building based on an overwhelming number of upcoming projects. And in case you're wondering what this product looks like, it's a document, usually 30 to 100 pages, and it comes in 3 types. Those 3 types are what's called a full reserve study, which is create from scratch, basically identify all the components, quantify the amount of asphalt, the amount of roofing, the square yards of carpeting, everything that you have at your facility. There's an update with site visit where all the component information has been established, and you're just updating the condition and the costs based on a re-inspection of those assets. And then there's an update no site visit. The update no site visit is just as it sounds like. Basically, it's an engagement where we're retained to update the cost factors. We double check with the client what projects have been done, what projects have not been done, what was done early, what's still doing just fine, basically updating all the information without the cost of a site inspection. And how this works is classically, most facilities only do 1 full reserve study, and that's fortunate because that's the most expensive engagement. The with site visit update is every few years, as you want someone with an independent set of fresh eyes to come and look over and see what's been going on, how has the deterioration been happening. And the no site visit is something that's done in the in-between years. It's a very cost-effective product. Now, these updates are necessary because in this field of making preparation for future events, you want to build your plans on recent information, not 3, 4, 5-year-old information. And this document obviously it will be based on different levels of research, the full update with site visit or update no site visit, but all reserve studies will contain the same 3 results. I'm going to keep it pretty simple here today for you. It all starts with a component list, and we call that the foundation of every reserve study. And that component list basically looks like this. I showed it to you earlier. It'll show the specific project. It may even show 2 projects for one asset, like the top 2, a seal project for your asphalt every 5 years, or a resurface project, or I should say, and a resurface project for your asphalt every 20 years or so. So it's all the major projects, identifying them, listing them, putting useful life, remaining useful life, and a current cost factor right next to it. And this is all established, as I indicated earlier, on a very consistent 4-part test. It's part of a national set of standards. Number 1, that it's the common area maintenance responsibility. It's not private property or an outside vendor. It has a limited useful life, not permanent. It has a predictable remaining useful life, meaning you know where it is on its life cycle, if it's near new or near old, and it needs to be above a minimum cost. We don't want to be reserving, having a planning document just for light bulbs, sprinkler heads, mops and buckets, things like that. So we want it to be limited to your significant infrastructure assets. And then comes a calculation of reserve fund strength. And this is basically measuring the size of your cash on hand compared to the amount of deterioration you have at the property. And this becomes the answer to the question, do we have enough money set aside? Or maybe, how are we doing? Are our set-asides on track? Have we been setting aside enough? And basically, how prepared are we? And this all is because the deterioration is inevitable. It's ongoing and predictable. So the only question is, are you keeping up with it? And it's kind of like this swimming race that you can see, where there's a pace line. Are you keeping up with the deterioration? If you're not keeping up with the deterioration, you're falling behind. And this measure of how well your reserve fund is doing compared to the deterioration of the property, that's a term that may be new to you. It's called percent funded. We don't measure it in terms of cash, and that's because the age, size, and makeup, the component list of every property is different, so we measure preparedness on a percentage basis. Now you can imagine that maybe a parking facility with not very much, almost no mechanical assets is going to have a very different deterioration dollar value after a few years than a city hall that's the same number of years old. So we measure preparedness by how much cash is set aside compared to the deterioration at the property. It's that ratio. Value of reserve cash, or cash in the bank, cash in savings, cash in CDs, cash in investments, compared to deterioration. And it is a balance. When the assets are in good shape, then you don't need much reserve cash to balance that small amount of deterioration. You're well funded. Now, on the other hand, give another illustration. If you have a lot of deterioration, if you have older facilities, but if you have a healthy reserve fund, a large reserve fund, then you can be well funded. The imbalance occurs in so many cases when the facility, the property, has significant deferred costs, a lot of deterioration around, and they don't have much cash. And that's what we see here, where there's the value of deterioration significantly outweighs the cash on hand. Now that balance point, when the two are in balance, is 100%, when the value of deterioration is offset by the same amount of money in reserves. And you can see we've outlined 3 distinct ranges here. The good range is anything above 70%, and that's just plain something to learn. If you're or one of your children is bringing home a chem exam with a 72, you may not be too pleased with that, but if your facility is 72% funded, that's actually a pretty good number. The fair range is in the 30 to 70% area, and the poor is 0 to 30%, and that's where we see a lot of problems. We're going to use a term here that we use in the residential industry called special assessment. For municipalities, that may be a cash call or a cash infusion need, but we see our clients needing a cash infusion when they are not prepared. You can see how that's much more frequently occurring when you're down in the 0 to 30% range. So this is why we break it into 3 distinct ranges. The 0 to 30% range is where there's a lot of financial anxiety going on. Anything above 70%, basically the cash calls are just noise, a little bit of random, irregular occurrences, nothing much you can do about that. So there's some very real consequences to being prepared. When you're prepared, you have smooth sailing. When you're not prepared, it's very irregular. And finally, the third result found in a reserve study is how much you need to set aside on an ongoing basis, depending on the magnitude and timing of your expenses, that component list that I showed a few moments ago, and the strength of your starting point. And some of you may be crossing your fingers. Sometimes it seems like a whole lot of cash, and the question is, how much do we responsibly need to contribute? Well, it's all just a matter of taking these expenses and breaking them down and spreading them out smoothly. As I said earlier, the expenses will happen. The only question is if you're financially prepared. That deterioration is inevitable, smooth and predictable, and this is your opportunity where you can use time to your advantage, using years to prepare for that inevitable expense. Now, we can make the recommendations, but the buy-in and implementation of the plan is your role. We can tell you that you've got 5 years until a $500,000 roof or asphalt project, and you can start preparing now, or, as I showed earlier, you can ignore, you can do wishful thinking, and just wait 5 years and react. What we counsel is take advantage of the opportunity to prepare. Put time on your side. You're the one who's responsible to maintain it. The deterioration is inevitable, and that cost is very predictable. So you can improve your own future. Now, I want to caution you that many of you will find you're behind, or maybe way behind, with respect to reserves. It's quite common, not a big deal. The good news is you don't have to solve the problem immediately. You can take time. It may take 3 or 5 years. It may take 10 years to begin to change the course of action. But your infrastructures, your facilities, your municipally owned assets are going to be around for a long time. You have the opportunity to shoulder through the burden of a few years, maybe of emergency expenses, but you can start softening that blow for the future. Start making your life a little easier and a little bit smoother for your property if you begin to start making preparations. And the good news also is that we've been back and forth helping clients. I think Paige mentioned over 45,000 engagements all across the country. So we can walk alongside you to help show you the way. It doesn't have to be something that you invent. So in addition to this webinar and others like it, we've got a large number of resources on our website, reservestudy.com. We've got a deep library of resources in our Learning Center, along with other webinars like this one that are recorded, ready on demand, all free. If you sense a need for our assistance and would love a proposal, you can do that just by clicking on the Request a Proposal icon or tab on our website. And by all means, if you heard about this webinar through a referral and didn't get an email directly, join our free emailing list. We don't abuse that privilege. It's just an announcement for upcoming webinars, things that might be of interest to you, give you those few aha moments, helpful hints, things like that make your life a little bit easier. And at this point in time, that wraps up my prepared curriculum for today, and I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will handle the Q&A in the last part of our session today. Paige.